Good morning, everybody. My name is Giuseppe. I work for VMware, and I've been working with MySQL for a long time. And also I am interested in open source, which is one of my hobby and also part of my work a bit. I have a Twitter account, Data Charmer, and I have a blog where sometimes I write about these kind of things. And I want to make clear that everything that I say here doesn't have anything to do with my company, and I don't work for Oracle. So if I say something good or bad about Oracle, it's just my fault. So let's cut to the chase. We are going to talk about roles. Roles is something that are available for MySQL since version 8.0. It's something that is created like a user and granted like a privilege. And important thing that we are going to show with examples needs to be activated. So what happened before we had roles? You need to create a user, and then what do? You do grant for something that you want that user to do, and then you create another user, and you do some more grants. Maybe they were the same grants that you did for the previous user, but you don't have a way of making sure that you are giving the same thing. So you create another user, grant, and oops, you know. It's really easy to make mistakes, and in addition to that, it's a lot of work. So what are the advantages of using roles instead of singular grants? First of all, you can have better system administration, so you can define all the things that you want to assign to a user once, and then assign to several users many times. And then also centralized grants handling. If you decide that a particular database or table should not be accessed anymore for whatever reason, you just change the role and the users don't need to be modified at all. In addition to this, it's also easier to understand what you are granting. So if you have meaningful role names, then your statistics will look much better. So let's start with a bad example, just because this is the way I started using roles, and this is the way I was beaten. So let's see if I get you to the same path. So I create one role named powerful. Then I grant everything to that role. Means that this role can do everything. Then I create a user, and I give a password to this user. And finally, I grant the role to the user. So looks quite good so far. So what are we going to do? We are going to take this new user and do something with it. And now I connect with the user do it all. I do a use test, and you see I get access denied. But you know, I should have everything. The show grants says that yes, I have the powerful role within my powers. So why is it that I cannot access this database? Let me not to give you the answer right now. So I'm going to show you how roles work, and then we are going to revisit this bad example. So principles. First of all, you need to create a role. Then grant something to that role. You create one user or many users, grant the role to the user, and now the missing piece, you have to set the default role. So unlike the normal privilege, the role needs to be activated. If you don't do set default role or something similar, which we will see, the role doesn't work. So, example, create role. Notice that when you create a role, you don't need to, you cannot have identified clause. Grant something to the role. This is the same thing that you do to a normal user. You just say, this role is authorized to do something. Then you create the user the usual way. And you grant the role to the user. Notice that there is not an on clause when you are granting. When you are granting a privilege, you say grant select on, for example, database test.star. Here you don't need on because the role has already its own scope. And then you set the default role. So you say alter user and default role, or there is a specific command, set default role to a specific user. This is something that is one of my beef with the database MySQL team. There are several ways of doing this operation, and sometimes users actually get confused. A few important points. You can have several roles for a user. So a role you can consider as a privilege. So you can have the set of privileges defined by several roles. You don't have to have one set of roles that includes everything. You just have several general roles and give one or two of them to each user. The important thing to remember is that the roles are not a new object in MySQL. Roles are saved in the user table. So they share the same table. In practice, when you create a role, the role is created without login, so the account is locked and there is an expired password. But for all practical purposes, is a user. Granting a role is not enough. We have seen that. I'm going to repeat this several times. And since the users and the roles live in the same table, you can grant a user to a user. Now, this sounds like a joke, but if you think about that, since when I create a role, the result is that I have a user, it means that I can have an existing user and assign it to another user. Don't do that, because there are several reasons why this is a bad idea. The point is that if you have roles, you should try to get organized and not use existing users as a role, because if you if you want to remove that user, then you will have trouble with the user to whom you have assigned this user as a role. Yeah, I know that I'm making this even more complicated than it should be, but okay. The point is this is complicated. And let's have a look at the syntax just to understand a couple of things that may confuse the first-time user. For example, me. Set role. Set role and role name is a session assignment of a role. So if I have several roles that I can use, but they are not active, I say set role and the name of the role, and that role will be available to me for that session. Now, set default role. This is an operation that assigns the role permanently. So it's not something that happens for a session, it happens forever. I cannot do that to my own user unless I have super user privileges. So it's something that the root account should do to other users. And now there is also a beautiful set role default. What does it mean? If I have several roles assigned to my user, and one of them is the default role, but I'm not using it at the moment, if I say set role default will bring me back to the default role that was assigned. Feeling good about this thing? Okay. It can be worse. The biggest thing that I have as an administrator about roles is that telling roles from users is not easy. So since roles are in the user table, when I want to look only at the roles that I have created, I have trouble. So there is no technical solution for this. The only thing that I can suggest is that you use a name convention. So you have a name convention for roles and a different name convention for users. This will make your life a lot easier, and I highly recommend it because there is a feature request for this, but has not been addressed yet. And from what I heard, it seems that the MySQL team is not interested into solving this problem. For example, in MariaDB, the same feature is solved by adding one column to the user table. So you say, if that column is set, this is a role, simply. So you know that I create a role, and then it becomes a user, and I am confused. So if you have a lot of users and roles, this is something that you should do. Just call your roles differently. For example, one thing that you can do, put the role names all in capital letters. Or just every role starts with R underscore. You will think about something. So there are a couple of tables that help you deal with roles. So in addition to the user table, the roles end up in two tables. One is called role edges, and it says which roles are assigned to which user. This is, for all practical purposes, your roles table. So this is something that you should use actively to see which roles you have in action. However, this will not tell you which roles exist but are not assigned to anybody. And then there is default roles, and this tells you which roles are assigned by default to somebody. So to make you understand how this works, I made a couple of examples. I created one database, Lord of the Rings, and I create some roles that are different for several categories of workers. So we have our LOTR observer, then we have tester, developer, and DBA. So we have 4 roles. What do? We say that the observer can only select, the tester can do select, insert, update, and delete, and the developer has all privileges on that database, and finally the DBA has all privileges on everything. And what do? We do the most beautiful list of users that you can ever see. And you see you have Bilbo, Frodo. If you know the Lord of the Rings, these are your guys. So we have observers that are Pippin, Merry, Boromir, and Gollum. And then we have testers that are Sam, Bilbo, and Gimli. The developers are Frodo, Aragorn, and Legolas. And finally, your DBAs are, of course, Gandalf and Galadriel. When you list your users, you have something like this. You see, immediately you see a difference because the users have a authentication string, so they have a password. Instead, the roles by default don't have one, but don't count on this to tell users from roles, because if you have a user without a password because you removed it or something else happened, then you may get confused. But anyway, it's nice to see this block of users, the block of roles and other users. As I mentioned before, you can find the roles empirically. So you can say which users have a password expired and the account locked. So in this case, you find the user. But using the convention that I was using in this example, if you search for users which name starts with R_, you will find them. The role edges is what you expect. You will see a list of roles assigned, and default roles, you will see the list of roles that are set as default. And using these two tables, you can do several queries that are more interesting for a DBA. For example, you say, who has DBA powers? So you just say, select the column two users from role ages, and where the name of the role is contains the DBA, and this gives you Galadriel and Gandalf. And using the same method, you get the list of the developers or the testers and so on. You can also make summaries using these tables. For example, the roles, you can say how many roles are assigned to each, how many users are assigned to each role, and who are these users. You don't need to take pictures. I will post the slides on Twitter later on. Just follow me. You can do the same operations for default roles. So let's see an example of what a user with or without a default role looks like. So if you do a show grants for a user with a default role, you see that the grants for that role are spelled out. So you see the second row says grant select insert update delete. These are the grants that come from a LOTR tester. And if you want to check that this user has a default role, you say select the current role and you get the role. Instead, when the user doesn't have a default role, you see that in grants, you have the name of the role, but not the privileges corresponding to that role. If you want to see what that role would imply, so you say show grants for that role using the name of the role. And in this case, you will see the privileges that belong to that to that role, but the role is not active yet. So if you want to use it, you need to activate it. So if you try to access the database, you will get access denied. So you need to set role, and then you can change database, and you will be granted access. Another thing that you need to remember is that set role is not permanent. So you start with set role, and then you see the role was set, so you have the role that you were supposed to have. You can enter the database, but then if you change database, if you refresh the connection, the role disappears, and then you get access denied. So with all this knowledge, let's go back to our bad example, the one that failed at the beginning. So we had use test and access denied, even though we had a role that should allow us to get everything. If we do show grants, we see that the role powerful is assigned to us. So what do we need to do? We need to say set role powerful, and when we do a show grants, we get everything. So this now the powers of the powerful role are really assigned, and after this, if we do a use test, then we are granted access. Stop.
But this will be until you end the session, of course.
Yes, yes, but there is something more that you can do. So you say that for me, if I have a role, it would be very convenient to have the role active always. So there is something that was added after a lot of people complained about the implementation, and there is one option, a general option, that it says activate all roles on login. What does it mean? That if you have assigned any role to any user, that user will have the roles, all the roles, active when it goes on. And there is another option called mandatory roles. And you can say every user will get this particular role or a list of roles when they connect. And this is not for every user, but is for all users. Let's make an example. We create a schema, LOTR, and we grant a select to the role LOTR reader, and then we set this LOTR reader as a mandatory role, meaning that this role will be assigned to every user. Then we create a user dummy, and what do? We try to enter database LOTR with the user dummy. And what happens here? The user is denied because the role is mandatory, meaning that is assigned, but is not default. So what do we do? As root, we say set global activate all roles on login equals 1. And then we connect again with the user dummy, and you see now we can connect, and show grants says that it has the privileges of the LOTR reader, and plus you see the role itself. Side effect of this mandatory role is that this mandatory role happens for everybody, even for the users that don't need it. For example, the user root already can access everything, but since we have this mandatory role, also the user root has the specific the specific grants that come from the mandatory role. So I hope that this will be fixed in later version, but for the moment this is the way it was. My wish list for roles: I wish we had some information schema or sys views that help dealing with roles. Most important, the list of roles separated from users, list of roles enabled for the current session, list of default roles, and list of users for a given roles. You know, are things that you can get already with more or less complicated query, but it would be nice to have views that make this easier. Also, I would like the roles to be active by default and to be disabled when not needed. So the opposite of what we have now, that the roles are inactive by default and you need to activate them. A latest addition that was added in MySQL 8.03, you can have the default role inside the create user. It's convenient because if you do a create user, then you see how you can recreate a user with the same roles. The problem is, in my opinion, that the role might not exist yet. So, you know, or might not been assigned yet. You have to do three things: create the user, create the role, assign the role to the user. You can create a user and say the default role is this, but you don't know if this default role exists. And if the user has not been assigned that role, this definition of default role will not work. I filed a bug about this, and I was told that it's not a bug, but it's a philosophical difference. So we'll see. We'll see. So how much time do we have still?
I think 15 minutes more.
Good.
So you're saying that if the role doesn't exist, you can still assign that to a user?
Yes.
And it's not a bug?
Hmm?
It's not a bug?
For me, it's a bug.
No.
A big bug. It says, okay, I got a really complicated answer from the developer saying that really it's not a bug because it's an object that might or might not exist. You know, basically, I didn't understand what they were smoking, but for me, the point is we have to administer users and privileges. So I have these building blocks that are the privileges and roles, and I would like to be able to assign something that already exists. And if it doesn't exist, I would like a big error, say, you cannot assign a role that doesn't exist to user X. That will make me happy. Also because if it allows me to assign a non-existing role to user X, and then I think that the user X can do what I want, but it doesn't. So I will be called at 2 a.m. saying, system has failed for a mysterious reason. And I would like to avoid that. Nobody calls me at 2 a.m. for this reason because I don't do DBA work, but just in general terms, you understand what I mean. Come on, I want to hear your feedback. This is a new feature, and I think that almost everybody wanted this feature. You were waiting for this to happen. So how do you feel? you can do what you want. It's just a bit more difficult than you expected, but let's see. Ronald.
It doesn't seem like there's a rename role, so that's good or bad. Like you can't change the name of the role.
You cannot change on the role. It's, you know, it's the same thing that you can do or not do with the user. You cannot change the user, but you can update the user table and then flash privileges.
So that's still a fundamental flaw.
Okay, so you have the same goods and the same bads that you have for users. If you have some specific curiosities, we can just see this in practice. Because I have a laptop and I can run MySQL here. Questions? Don't be shy. You can ask in Spanish if you want, or in Italian.
So you mean when you are you're using the new feature and you assign to a role that doesn't fit, the system doesn't say, hey, this role is not existing?
Yeah.
I mean, because maybe the role exists, but you just label it badly. So instead of role admin, you said admin T. So maybe because you didn't realize that you miswritten the role.
Could be. So let's try to get let's try to do this. So create a user dummy identified by dummy. Grant. Let's say you see the list of the roles that we have there. Let's make it bigger. Grant they changed it. Oh, okay. No, one moment. It's the default role. Set default role Gandalf to dummy. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't exist anymore. Anyway. Gandalf is not granted to dummy. Okay, I take it back. This was a bug in 8.04. In 8.0.11, it was fixed. But they didn't tell me. Okay, so it's a bit better than what I said. So the default thing has been modified a bit. So you get an error, and this is what I wanted. It makes the situation a bit better.
The example that you had, you tried to create the user and in the same sentence just adding the default role.
Yeah, maybe create user dummy default role.
Yes, when you create the user.
This is what this was the bug that I mentioned in.
But you won't get create user anyway. It doesn't show in the history.
It's fixed correctly. So the only thing here, okay, let's put a role that exists. Do it all. So this is a user that has default user do it all, but I didn't assign this user, this role. So let's see, select star from role edges. It assigned it automatically. Wow. Okay, they fixed it. Hmm?
You should check the bug report.
I'm checking the bug reports and didn't get an update on this. So I will close it anyway. Very good. So this shows that doing a presentation, you learn things. So now it's time for the next speaker. How many? At what time do you have to start? Okay. Time for one more question? No? Then I give you time for a coffee. Thank you.